Hello, and welcome to you all this evening to this Christians in Science conversation event. My name is Gavin Merrifield, and I am the General Secretary of Christians in Science. I'll be handing over shortly to Emily, who is one of our committee members, and she'll be hosting us for the rest of tonight. But before I do, I just wanted to mention a few things quickly. If you don't know who Christians in Science is, we are an organisation that seeks to encourage and build better relations between the church and the modern scientific enterprise in all of its forms. And we aim to help the church and society more broadly to enjoy what science is telling us about the world and the universe that we live in. And we aim to encourage scientists themselves and also to equip the church to engage with science in positive and uplifting ways. As part of this, our events run from a Christian perspective, but anyone from any background with an interest in how science, religion, and faith might positively enrich each other is very welcome here tonight as well. You have seen the slides as you arrived in, talking about our upcoming events and the resources that we have available. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that aren't on there, as 2026 is upon us, and it's going to be an exciting year for Christians in Science. And we'd very much value your prayers for our organisation, its trustees, and our committee members as we prepare for this big year for us. There's a lot of change on the immediate horizon with how we're going to be running things in the organisation, where we might be focusing our efforts and how we'll support each other in that. There are some challenges involved in this, but I think we will rise to meet them. Those of you who are members and supporters of Christians in Science will have got some of these hints already in recent months, and we'll be writing to you in the new year more formally about this. Alongside these challenges and changes, we've got a lot of opportunities as well. The most prominent of these is that we've been asked to work with the Satellites Youth Festival in early August, providing input around science and Christian belief specifically, but also to bring a programme of fun and engaging science activities to that event. Youthscape, who are the organisation behind the festival, expect about 5,000 teenagers and their leaders to be on site that week. So this is going to be a huge job for us, but it's also a huge opportunity for us to engage with a strategic group of young people and build relationships with their leaders. So it's going to be hard work, but it will be a lot of fun as well, and I think very worthwhile. So if you can be praying for all of that, we'd greatly appreciate that. And also, if you'd like to volunteer to be on the Satellites Youth Team Festival, just let me know as well. We're going to be needing all hands on deck to pull that off successfully. So, apart that aside, without further ado, I will hand over to Emily for the rest of the evening. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Gavin. Hopefully you can all hear me. Sorry, I am back again. There you go. Hopefully that's better. So I am also very excited about today's discussion and introducing you to some of our panelists that are going to be talking to you more about this brilliant book that they've put together called God, Struggle and Sufferings in the Evolution of Life. And what Gavin's going to do for me just now is we're just going very briefly through a quick intro. You can buy this book in printed form, but it is also available open access. So Gavin's going to post a couple of links for you to get that. So if you haven't yet had a look at it, I really highly recommend you do. We will be going through a bit more detail about each individual's contribution to the books, different areas where there's perhaps some similarities and differences, and future areas. So do please join the discussion. There will be some time at the end for a Q&A. As we're going through, if you want to start posting some questions in the chat, you can do that, but we'll come back and invite you to do more of them at the end. But as part of this brilliant book that's been brought together, first of all, I'd like to introduce to all of the authors. So first of all, we've got Professor Christopher Southgate, who's joining us today. We've also got Reverend Professor Paul Fiddes, who's joining us, Reverend Dr. Michael Lloyd. We've also got Professor Neil Messer, and we've got Dr. Bethany Sollereder as well, who are all with us today. But rather than me going into more detail about what their individuals' perspectives are on the book, I'm first of all going to invite Christopher to take us off, and then we'll go through each one in order just to tell us a bit more about your contributions to the book, your kind of stance on it, and then we'll go from there. So first of all, over to you, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Emily, and many thanks to Christians in Science for this invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to the questions that arise from it. So the presenting problem that's addressed in this book is that the natural world, and we're thinking now outside and beyond the question of the influence of humans, the natural world seems full of struggle and violence and competition and indeed extinction. So 5 fairly orthodox Christian theologians, all committed to a view of God as creator of the universe out of nothing, wrestle together with how it can be that the character of the creation can be compatible with the character of the God who loves the world and redeems it through Jesus. We all found ourselves rejecting the neo-Cartesian position that non-human creatures are incapable of suffering, and also the recent claim that some animals can suffer, but in practice do not. And we also, importantly, all rejected the arguments that place the blame for struggle and suffering on primordial human sin, given especially that we know that struggle and violence were features of the world long before humans evolved. So I am, in a sense, to blame for this project in that it was I who convened the group. And in doing so, I asked my colleagues 4 questions. First, is it appropriate to seek an originating cause of disvalues in the natural world? And if so, what is that originating cause? So that's about how the world is originally set up, as it were. Second, what is God's relation moment by moment to the suffering of non-human creatures in the wild? So that takes in the question of possible divine co-suffering, but also the question of God's providential action in nature. Third, what role does atonement play in your scheme? And fourth, what role does eschatological life play in your scheme? And I also asked colleagues to comment on what they saw as the strengths and weaknesses of their own position. So the first part of the book consists of our initial answers to those questions. And it turned out that our views lay on a spectrum from Michael Lloyd's espousal of an angelic fall to Bethany Sollereder's denial of any fallenness in the non-human world. So in a minute, you'll hear that spectrum articulated as each of the scholars summarizes their position. And then when we've heard the initial summaries, then we'll engage with one another's positions, mirroring, in a sense, what happens in the second half of the book. So that's just about enough introduction. I think I just add 2 thoughts to end this introduction. First, that interestingly, we didn't quite agree on all elements of what the problem is. And there's a fascinating disagreement as to whether biological death forms part of the problem or not. Secondly, and here I want to quote a very helpful insight of Paul Fiddes. Paul writes towards the end of the book that he sees theodicy in 2 stages. The first stage, which can be constructed through reasonable argument, answers the question, can we think coherently and responsibly about both a good creator and a universe that contains suffering? Can we hold together God and the world as we know it in one consistent thought. And but the second question, the second element in complete theodicy for Paul is the question, is this suffering worth it? And for the second question, Paul sees that as a matter of faith commitment rather than in terms of the framing of coherent argument. And I personally found that very interesting summary of the task facing us as we explore the question of suffering in the created world. So that is quite enough by way of introduction, I think, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing my colleagues' summaries of their positions, which we're going to take in the order in which they appeared in the book. So that starts with Michael Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Christopher. You've given away my position without a spoiler alert, but never mind, I will cope with that. And I'm not going to expand on all the questions that Christopher asked all the contributors, partly because of time and partly because you ought to buy the book, obviously. So I basically have a kind of taxonomy of responses to the problem of evil, in particular the problem of pre-human evil that we've been discussing in this book. And it's a threefold taxonomy. I think by and large you can divide Christian responses to the problem of pre-human suffering in these three ways. The first group is those who believe suffering as being instrumental to the purposes of God. Second group believes that suffering is inevitable within the purposes of God, and the third believes that suffering is inimical to the purposes of God. I just want to expand very briefly on those three. The first, the instrumental view, believes that God created the world in such a way that it would necessarily create violence and struggle and death and frustration and extinction, but justifies that by saying, because of the good that comes from it, you need the evil, you need the suffering in order to have the goods, and therefore it is instrumental. As all these three approaches, it has some problems. It has the problem of compatibility with what we know about God through the healing ministry of Jesus. Jesus seems to have had a view of suffering as being bad and something to be undone, something to be taken away, something to be put right, not as something that was advancing the purposes of God. That's a real challenge that this position faces. And it also faces the difficulty of articulating why we should fight against it. If it's divinely ordained, divinely intended, if it does us good, why should we fight against it? That's a second problem that the instrumental view faces. The second, I think, is the inevitable view, that suffering is inevitable within the purposes of God. And that is basically the belief that you cannot, even God cannot create a physical world without clash, without struggle, without conflict. And it may be bad, it may be tragic, the consequences, but they are inevitable if you're going to have a physical creation, and it was good that there was a physical creation. The problems with that is it has to give an account of why it's inevitable within the purposes of God. And it needs to do that in a way that avoids sailing too close to the Manichaean wind. And secondly, how come there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth? How do you explain that eschatological vision? If it's possible then, why isn't it possible from the start? The inimical view says, no, it is not intended, not divinely intended. It is not the work of God. It is the work of a creature, and therefore has a doctrine of the fall, an account, a narrative of the fall, as the intrusion of something unintended by the divine into the creation of God. And this faces the problem of modern evolutionary science, which makes it impossible to attribute all suffering to human beings. I, however, take this latter view that suffering is inimical to the purposes of God. And I do so by remembering that there is within Jewish and Christian tradition the belief that there are free, rational, intelligent agents in creation other than human beings, and that there is within that tradition an account of rebellion within that realm, and suggesting that that could have dislocated the whole creative process, luring it away from God's original harmonious purposes for creation. And if you want to see what it would have looked like for human beings to have done what they were called to do, to fill the earth and subdue it, i.e. to put it right, you look at the person of Jesus, and here at last is a human being doing what human beings were always called to do, to fill the earth and subdue it, to heal the sick, to raise the dead. So that's the fall of the angels hypothesis. I argue that it has a number of strengths and obviously some weaknesses as well. The strengths I see as being it is unambiguously committed to the goodness of God. We don't have to say, well, God, did it, but we say, no, God didn't do it. It was not of him. It's not his desire. It is not his purpose. He's against it, and he calls us to be against it. That's just straightforward. Secondly, it validates our protests. It says that not only do we protest against suffering, God also protests against suffering, and we are in harmony with him when we do so. Thirdly, it has what I call Christological conformity. Our own action against suffering meshes with the healing ministry of Jesus. And it has, fourthly, pastoral clarity. It enables us to say to somebody who is suffering, what you are going through is not the will or purpose of God. God is not intending it or imposing it or inflicting it. And what you are going through is not his choice. It has been brought into existence by creatures against the will and the plan and the purpose of God. So it has a pastoral clarity to it. In terms of the weaknesses, I give two in the book. One is the difficulty of giving a coherent account of freedom. Why did the angels fall? If they were in the immediate presence of God, what could have motivated that? That's a tricky. There's been some good work done on that, but I think there's more work that needs to be done. And of course, the concept of the demonic has been hugely misused and abused in all sorts of horrifying ways. And so I'm nervous about it for that reason, but I think it does shed light into this area that is badly needed. So that's my basic summary of my opening position.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think we're going to hear now from Neil Messer.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. So in terms of Michael's taxonomy, my position is in his third category regarding evolutionary suffering and other disvalues as inimical to the purposes of God. And my position has some features in common with Michael's, but also some significant differences from it. So when I was answering Chris's first question, is it appropriate to seek originating causes for disvalues, such as evolutionary suffering? I was more inclined than some of my co-authors to answer no. At any rate, I'm wary of the search for originating causes, which is in Paul Fiddes's schema the first step of a Christian theodicy. I'm wary of that, or wary of the way that that's been done in this discussion of evolution and suffering for various reasons. I think that theological project has certain dangers. Whether I've managed to avoid seeking originating causes altogether, well, there's some room for discussion about that, maybe. But at any rate, I find myself wanting to reframe the debate somewhat. So let me put it this way. My starting point in trying to think about the goodness of God and the goodness of creation in relation to evolutionary suffering and other disvalues, my starting point is to begin with a sharp dissonance, which Chris already hinted at in his opening remarks. So the dissonance I'm talking about is the dissonance between what I think is a very plausible and reasonable, biblically informed vision of the goodness of creation and the goodness of God's creative purposes. Genesis 1 says that God saw everything God had made and it was very good. What does very good look like? Well, I think it makes a great deal of sense to argue that the creation narrative in Genesis 1 gives us a vision of what very good looks like, a vision that's reinforced by other key biblical texts, such as well, let's say eschatological vision of the peaceable kingdom in Isaiah 11. If we let our vision of the goodness of God's creative purposes be formed by biblical texts such as those, it looks like God's good purposes for creation don't involve violence between creatures. They don't involve predation, for example, and other forms of creaturely violence, either between humans and other creatures or between other than human creatures. God's good creative purposes don't apparently include the scarcity that gives rise to the struggle for existence that drives biological evolution. I would want to argue that there's a case, at any rate, for saying that pain and death don't belong with this vision of God's good creative purposes. And by extension, we could say that species extinction doesn't conform with those good purposes. So that's one side of the dissonance. The other side is that if we take an honest look at the process of biological evolution, which is the only way we know of in our universe in which complex life and the whole variety of life we see on planet Earth can come into being. If we look at that evolutionary process, it doesn't just give rise to these disvalues of death, destruction, pain and suffering, and so on. It doesn't just give rise to these disvalues, it depends on them. The creative engine of natural selection that drives the evolutionary process intrinsically depends on scarcity, competition for scarce resources, which involves death and destruction. And evolution intrinsically involves creaturely violence and suffering in all kinds of ways. So we have this dissonance between what I've suggested is a plausible form of a very plausible and persuasive, biblically informed vision of what the goodness of God's creation looks like, or what God's good creative purposes look like, and on the one hand, and the character of the process that has generated all creaturely life that we know of on the other. So what do you do with that dissonance? What do you do with that tension? One thing you could do with it is to is to revise that biblically informed vision of God's good creative purposes and say, no, it must be that God's good creative purposes include creaturely violence, scarcity, struggle, suffering, and so on, because that's, you might say that because that's the only way that complex life can arise in our universe. You might say that, or you might do what I choose to do and find ways theologically of living with the tension. To say, no, we have this dissonance between the way that we see the natural world working and what the scriptures and Christian tradition reveal to us of God's good creative purpose. And that requires us to say of the world that we inhabit and the world that we know, it is both God's good creation and in various ways it's tragically flawed, broken, awry from those good purposes of God. So we say of the world we inhabit, it's both good and, if you like, fallen. Fallen, not if we're talking about nature beyond the human, fallen not as a result of human sin, that we've already established that as one of our starting points. But my position indexes these various evolutionary disvalues to evil in some form. Maybe, yeah, we might call this natural evil, evil that's not directly the result of human sin, but is another way in which the creation is astray from God's good purposes. So I want to say that's the reality of the world we inhabit, both God's very good creation and fallen, broken in profound and tragic ways. The heart of the Christian hope is that in the person, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, God has decisively done something about that. God has decisively acted against the brokenness and the fallenness of the world. Not only human sin and the ways in which that alienates us from God, but also, I would want to say, all those other ways in which the creation is astray from God's good and loving purposes. So the cross and the resurrection are the heart of God's response to the problem I've identified. And that points us to a future hope in which God will restore and transform all things. Well, restore may be a misleading word, but God will finally, decisively overcome the brokenness of the creation, transform the creation into a new creation in which, as Revelation 21 says, there will be no more death, mourning, crying, pain. These disvalues that we see not only in human life but in the natural world, but that have been part of the natural world for long before humans came on the scene. These disvalues will be no more. They'll be decisively overcome, and all God's creatures will live creaturely lives in the new creation that are the ultimate fulfillment of all God means them to be. So I want to read the Christian hope in a way that decisively answers the tension that we're responding to in the present. What does that mean for us? Well, it means a calling to live here and now in the light of that future hope, not, I would say, to attempt to inaugurate that hope or to begin to bring it to reality. That's God's work, not ours. But we can live here and now in ways that witness to that future hope and align with it. So a big part of the importance of this discussion for me as a theological ethicist is what it implies for Christian ethical living in the world here and now. So that's in outline the position I bring to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Alas, it's my turn now to speak about my position, although a big part of me would rather listen to the music of my colleagues' elegant theological thinking. But so my own position is largely informed by what's often called the only way argument, which actually overlaps Michael's categories of the instrumental and the inevitable. And it suggests that if God's purposes indeed were to create physically embodied creatures in which could develop complexity, ingenuity, beauty, interdependence, and flourishing, the evolutionary process, with all its concomitant disvalues, was a necessity. That seems to me both an eminently plausible scientific guess and also a good theological guess, because it seems to me that if God could have contrived this creation without such a level of disvalue, then a loving God would have done so. A big strength, I think, of the only way argument is that it acknowledges to the full that it is the same processes that have given rise to values in evolution that also give rise to disvalues. So that's 95.5% of my position, but I've found myself experimenting more recently with supplementing it with a sense that perhaps a few elements in the non-human creation might manifest a certain resistance to the purposes of God. And we might see that, for instance, in viruses, which are parasitic on life and make out of it non-life, and perhaps also in cancers, which take complexity of life and make out of it quantities of something largely lacking in complexity. And possibly also in the way in which we see viciousness in a creature as sophisticated as a chimpanzee, which seem a kind of travesty of social behavior and cooperation. These resistive behaviors may perhaps be thought to result from elements of the creation being tempted by spiritual forces resistant to God, and that would draw me near to Michael Lloyd's position. But that is a further speculation which is detachable from this initial premise of the possibility of some resistance. But importantly, and very distinctly from Michael's position, this resistance is for me a small component in the disvalues in creation. And God must be taken to bear almost all the responsibility for the disvalues that we've named, for violence and struggle and suffering and extinction. I think that to go on through those questions that I began by asking, I do affirm God's co-suffering with the suffering of all the creatures that suffer. In terms of atonement, I think this is one of the hardest elements in this subject, but two key elements of it for me are a sense, which I take from the work of Francis Young, that God in Christ accepts responsibility for all that is suffered by creatures, and in so doing submits to suffering of the most extreme kind. And I also want to hold that the cross and resurrection inaugurate the final eschatological phase of the history of the world, which will end with God's final consummation of all things, as Neil just so elegantly depicted. And as my other colleagues do, I hold that that final consummation will include resurrected creatures of all kinds. I think that's quite enough to say at this juncture, and I look forward very much to hearing from Bethany Sollereder, who is next on our list.
Great, thank you, Chris. My position has come to kind of be known as the without a fall theodicy or approach, and in saying that, I'm not saying that I don't think humans are sinful. I do think that humans have sin and that we inflict suffering on the world, which is inimical to God's purpose with Michael's third category. So when I speak, I'm really talking about how animals and other non-human animals and the rest of creation relates to itself. So this primarily relates to the evolving world prior to humans as my sort of case study. And I happen to think that suffering is really an evolved skill. It's a highly evolved skill that only sits with a very small amount of life on Earth. And so, is suffering inevitable in Michael's second thing? I don't think so, because the vast majority of life on Earth flourishes, lives, and dies without ever suffering. Plants, bacteria, archaea, even a majority of animals, if you don't think insects or worms can sort of suffer in important ways. So if you take birds, mammals, and fish, you get to something like 0.14% of life on Earth by weight can suffer in a meaningful way. And so this is suffering that has developed as a skill because it's such a help to survival. And so it is instrumental, but I don't think that it's God's instrumentality that is the thing to worry about here, as if God's sort of saying, you will all suffer, but that's a price I'm willing for you to pay. Rather, it's the instrumentality of the creatures themselves, that those who have a capacity to suffer do avoid painful situations better and survive better. And so what we have in creaturely suffering is harm, but not something evil. We have a conflict of goods that happens between creatures trying to survive and creatures needing to eat and choosing to eat each other, either through predation or parasitism in the various ways. And so if I'm going to ask about what the originating causes of these disvalues of harm and violence and suffering, I would say first creaturely agency in animals choosing their lifestyles and their living with evolved capacities, and then with accident and contingency. So sometimes rocks fall, water floods, and it's not as if I think God is causing these things to happen, because a flood right there would be great, but within the freedom of creaturely process, we have these harms that emerge. What is God's relation moment by moment? Here I'm going to echo Chris and sort of say that it is God's co-suffering, but also that there is an element of God creating meaning out of the suffering in response to it. So God continues to write the story of creation through the lives of later creatures in ways that bring meaning to what at the time that it happened may have been meaningless suffering. What role does eschatological life play in your scheme? Well, I think that I sort of hold to what I call bio-universalism, the idea that all creatures, all dogs and all beetles go to heaven, and perhaps every archaea and bacterium as well. And so there is a great sense of God capturing the richness of this fleeting creation in the eschatological life. But I think it also describes what will be, but not what was or what was supposed to be. And so in that sense, I think there's a way that my seeing the eschatological life as what creation is reaching towards, but not what it should be now, helps guide sort of my ethical approaches. So I don't think, for example, that we should go out and try and make lions vegetarian because Isaiah says that the lion will lay down with the lamb, and will eat straw as the ox. I don't think we should necessarily try to prevent all instances of suffering, and that is a question that requires judgment. And of course, when we're talking about how we treat humans, it's going to be very different from whether we should be out vaccinating wild populations, for example. So I wouldn't think we should be vaccinating wild populations. But I also think in some of the terms of our own ethics, when it comes to, is it okay to eat meat? I think that, we can look forward and say, okay, in heaven, there won't be killing. And so presumably there won't be eating of other animals. But Jesus also talks about how there'll be eschatological celibacy. And so in the same way that in heaven, there'll be no marriage or giving to one another in particular ways. But I don't think that everyone should necessarily embrace that now, that there can be an eschatological vegetarianism here that is honorable, but is a particular calling, not a universal calling, just as eschatological celibacy is a particular calling for some people, but is not universal. I think that one of the problems with my approach is it's really not much of a theodicy. It doesn't give a justification apart from sort of saying, well, this is the way that evolution seems to happen. It's more of a theological description of the world that involves God. And I think it also, with the idea of sort of God meaning making and responding to the ways that creatures choose and act, it relies on sort of an open theist or a process theist approach. And so if you took a more classical theist view, it would have to be changed in particular ways to try and account for that. Thank you.
Oh, unmute. Last but by no means least, we come to Paul Fiddes, who made such a contribution to the project, having originally been recruited as its chair. Paul.
Well, thank you. Well, you've heard that the question being addressed by my fellow contributors is this: has something gone wrong with the natural world before the impact of sinful human beings? Two of my colleagues answer no, or not much at any rate. Two of them answer yes, things have gone wrong. Well, I answer yes and no. No, some suffering is necessary in the evolutionary process for the emergence of fully personal beings capable of love. Nothing has gone wrong so far. But also, yes, there is an excessive, a disproportionate suffering in the way that life has actually developed, which God doesn't intend. So I suggest that creation at every level has the capacity for both response and resistance to the persuasive influence of the triune God, which is moving all created beings and things towards flourishing and fulfillment. It's resistance to God that lies at the base of the disproportionate suffering that we see in the non-human creation, and we can call it a kind of fallenness. And I've been arguing this for nearly 40 years now. Christopher, you've heard, allows for a limited resistance, limited to parasites, cancers, viruses, and rare occasions of vicious predation. For me, this resistance is widespread. The idea of resistance here has to be coupled, I think, with the idea of drift. Everything raised from nothing has the possibility of letting go of the good and slipping back or drifting towards nothing. And this falling back is a destructive non-being. It's a resistance to God's purposes. Now, I developed several implications of this resistance. First, it's a complex free response to God, entangled with accident, randomness, and contingency. It only becomes free will in personal beings, though it has a family likeness to both freedom and sin in human beings who've emerged from the natural world. Secondly, this response or resistance must happen throughout the cosmos, in inanimate objects as well as in living beings. But there's no reason to suppose that objects respond to God as large-scale items, like a rock. We can think of response at the lowest quantum level that builds up into the objects that we see. Third, there's no need to find a scientific mathematical language to describe this resistance. The action of God is persuasive, not coercive, and so doesn't require a physical account of causation. So this is also the case with response or resistance. And the Bible, of course, provides many poetic accounts of the response of the whole natural world to God. Fourthly, response and resistance is to a triune God. All created beings and matter dwell together in an environment which is nothing less than the interweaving relations of divine love. The atoning cross of Christ and the suffering of God makes a difference to that influential environment of love, deepening God's persuasion and eliciting response. Fifth, though this resistance is a non-being which is alien to God and God's intentions for creation, God must be finally responsible for giving the good gift of freedom to creation to be self-creative. And sixth, no single instance of suffering ought to be attributed to a particular act of resistance. Rather, over many millennia, resistance has built up in complex ways to make the kind of natural world we see now with its disproportionate suffering. Now, I issued a challenge to my fellow writers, which, with great respect, I'm not sure they've answered. In different ways, the 4 papers envisage some kind of providential but non-coercive influence by God on the self-creation of created beings at many levels of the cosmos. Across the range of the papers, I see it's called persuasion, offering possibilities, allure, protection, pressure, salvific and transformative presence, helping, or meaning-making. Even Bethany allows for this influence in the case of living beings. Now, a positive activity of God, an open-ended invitation, implies some sort of responsiveness to God, and I argue that this must in turn imply the possibility of failure to respond or to resist this invitation. And that, I think, is at the basis of the excessive suffering that we see in the natural world.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, in his inimitable way, Paul ends with a challenge to us in terms of God's persuasive invitation, which must imply for Paul the possibility of a failure to respond or to resistance. I wonder which colleague would like to take that up. I know Bethany's got some views on this, but whether she'd like to be first or whether...
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I mean, I just think until you get to humans, animals completely fulfill that calling. There is no resistance. But in the words of George Manley Hopkins, what I do is me. For that I came. They fling out abroad their name, etc., etc. So I think that they fulfill the calling that God has for them, which is to pursue flourishing as best they can. But humans do not.
Other colleagues?
I think I'm very happy to see resistance at the levels where there is the machinery to make a choice. Whereas what I find difficult about Paul's position is it seems to require resistance, free resistance, because otherwise it's actually God who's responsible, God who's the agent. Free resistance at lower levels, lower than there is actually equipment to make a choice. And that's my problem with the extension of resistance, or the dependence upon resistance, is that at those lower levels where there isn't that mechanism, it seems to me that God ends up being responsible for the suffering. I know Paul allows that there's some ultimate sense in which God is responsible for everything, which I also deny, but I think it's too great a dependence on God where there isn't consciousness, where there isn't physical freedom.
Neil, did you want to take this up?
Yeah, I mean, in the discussions that fed into the book, I mean, I found Paul's proposal about resistance and thinking about evolutionary disvalues in terms of resistance, quite helpful and intriguing, and it's related in some ways to the ways in which I've wanted to think about evil in relation to the fallenness of creation in the past. So if I want to associate evolutionary disvalues with evil, to say they don't conform to God's good and loving purposes, I need a way of speaking about evil without either connecting it all to human sin, which as we've already said won't work, or elevating evil to some kind of equal and opposite power to God, which is a classic Christian heresy that's important to avoid for all kinds of reasons. Paul's account of resistance, Paul himself associates with a long-standing Christian tradition of thinking about evil as the privation of good, a kind of falling away from God's good purposes, and that has kind of resonances with how I want to think about evil in these discussions as well. So I've I mean, part of what I do in the later part of the book is to pick up Paul's account of resistance and see how far I can push it in terms of my own approach to these questions. How persuaded anyone else was by that? Well, not very, it turned out, but it seemed to me that there was material here for a fruitful conversation anyway. Let me leave it at that.
Yes, I suppose I mean, in my only way bit of my position, I think that God does offer a persuasive invitation or lure towards towards additional possibilities of cooperation and self-transcendence, but I don't see the opposite of that as being a slide towards non-being. That's an element of Paul's position that I can't quite seem to get hold of, perhaps because I don't like these privation arguments. So I've got, yes, I can go only so far with his invitation, I think. But perhaps it'd be worth touching for a moment on an area of curious agreement between the team, which was it was interesting the extent to which we all wanted to affirm an eschatological consummation of creatures, and I think a number of us were attracted to the work that Bethany has done in this area, and in particular to the notion that the violent struggle between creatures might be transformed. Well, I personally find this very attractive notion that it might be transformed into a form of sport. Well, of course, when one's just contemplated the ashes, one might think rather grimly about this analogy. But Bethany, do you want to take that up?
Yeah. Sure. So there was a debate in the literature about, to what extent is a lion in heaven? Can it still be a proper lion? If it's straw eating and it's lost all its nature to hunt, is it really still a reasonable lion? And yet people wanted to say that it would be a peaceable lion in line with the ideals of God's peaceful kingdom. So I was sort of just sitting there thinking, well, most humans today don't hunt and kill in the way that most humans would have likely have done historically. Many people today will never have killed an animal, and yet we're not less human necessarily because of that. But I sort of thought about how we've taken a lot of those instincts and those skills that we would have used for hunting, and as Chris said, turn them to sport. And so I think if you want to see the human body in excelsis doing the most it possibly can, you wouldn't necessarily go to a warrior. You might go to Simone Biles and her Olympic performances. You might go to a pole vaulter. You'd go to these people who really, are athletes who push the human body to the fullness of its potential. And so I sort of thought, well, maybe there's some analogy to that. So I don't know if, lions will play tennis in heaven, but some turning of the instincts that they use to hunt or to violent ends on earth towards perhaps, the pursuit of God himself. I love that image in The Last Battle of C.S. Lewis of all the animals and all the people sort of further up and further in pursuit of God in God's self as the great hunt of heaven.
But Bethany,
sorry. Two things to add to that. One is that in one of the volumes of his book on animals, the animal theologian David Clough describes how his family cat Mitzi is a really keen bird watcher. She's an avid bird watcher. She'll kind of sit on his desk, looking out of his study window at the birds out in the garden, twitching her tail. Absolutely fascinating. Of course, what she really wants to do is to hunt them and kill them. And he says, fortunately for the birds, she's a pretty poor hunter. But he muses on the possibility that in the eschaton, in the resurrection life, she'll retain her avid interest in bird watching, but she'll be freed from the need and the desire to kill and eat the birds that she watches with such fascination. So kind of Mitzi as an ornithologist in the life to come. And I find this this line of thinking very attractive, and it's something I pick up in to some extent, in my contributions to the book and in other things I've written since we published the book, I think it's important to emphasize, I mean, all of this is no more than a flight of the imagination, because that's basically most of what we're engaged in whenever we think about eschatology, whenever we think about the life of the world to come. We have hints in scripture developed through reflection in the Christian tradition. We have indications of what's of the kind of character that the future hope we're promised in the resurrection might be. We don't have more than that, and beyond that, all we can do is speculate and imagine. But the importance of this kind of discussion is that if we want to affirm the kind of eschatological hope that I think we're all affirming for the whole creation, we need to have a theological imagination that's big enough to be capable of imagining that, you know, lions could be perfectly fulfilled as lions without doing you know, harm and lethal violence to other creatures, and so on. So that's the importance and the value of these kinds of imaginative pictures, such as Bethany's articulated.
And I'm also warm towards Bethany's kind of imaginative picture, but it does raise the important question of, if lions can be leonine in the new creation, why not create them for play rather than for predation now? Why do we not go straight to that eschatological vision? And
well, I think that's a very important question for proponents of the only way argument in particular, and so I think that argument has to be extended by saying that the sorts of beings that will ultimately arrive in heaven could not have arisen except through this physical evolutionary process with all the baggage that we've talked about it's involving. So only after the cross and resurrection make possible a new phase can creatures start to be transformed into their final playful state.
The question is, sorry.
Yeah, no.
The question that follows from that, of course, is how you evaluate that only way constraint that Chris has just articulated. And you might say that's inevitable. You might say it's instrumental, going back to Michael's taxonomy. One possibility I've tried out in the book, which didn't meet with resounding approval from my colleagues, but I still think it has something going for it, is to say that the only way that only way situation that Chris has articulated is itself part of the problem, itself an aspect of the way in which creation as we find it, as we experience it, doesn't yet fully measure up to the good and loving purposes of God. But nonetheless, I mean, that allows me to agree with Chris that in this world, as we find it, the only way lions can evolve is through this process of struggle, violence, and predation. And the only thing a lion can be in this world is a predator. And that takes me back to something Bethany said in her opening presentation, which is that she wouldn't want to try and turn lions into vegetarians. Neither would I. I think predation is part of what's wrong with the world, but it's an inescapable feature of the world as we inhabit it. And well-intentioned efforts to end predation in this world, or I'm inclined to say well-intentioned efforts to end other evolutionary disvalues like non-anthropogenic species extinction, might end up doing more harm than good. They might end up inhibiting the flourishing of creatures in this world. And they are well-intentioned efforts that we should, I think, steer clear of, because we should have a keen and lively sense of the work that God gives us to do as human creatures in the world, and the work that God promises to do, which is only God's work. So I wouldn't want to make lions vegetarian in this world, but I do think that many human beings, not all by any means, but because of their circumstances or situations, but many human beings, including many of us in this Zoom call, I'd venture to speculate, could perfectly well be vegetarian or vegan. We can flourish without those forms of violence toward other creatures. And I would regard a calling like that, or an ethical response like that, as something that goes a little further than a calling akin to eschatological celibacy. Yes, it does witness to the eschatological hope, but it also it's also a way of disentangling us from forms of violence toward other creatures in this world that that are often egregious. It's a way in which we can help to make some of our fellow creatures' lives somewhat better than they already are.
I just wanted to observe that there is quite a disparity between the only way argument being advanced by Neil and that by Chris, because for Neil, the world as it in the world as it is, because of fallenness and because of evil, this is the only way the world can be. Whereas for Chris, of course, he sees this as the intention of God, that this is the only way the world can be. As a matter of fact, I'm very close to Neil, and I said that in one of my responses. I think our difference would be that I see a mixed picture. That is, that there is a mixture here in the way the world is between what God intends and what has happened through this slipping away from the goodness of God. And so it's complex in that way. Some suffering must be within God's intention. I would agree with Chris, but not the widespread, disproportionate, excessive suffering that we see. And here I'd agree with Neil. But I just want to make clear that we mustn't gloss over, as it were, this question of the only way as if it's the same thing. And this may be why Neil's proposal didn't gather quite the consent he hoped for, though it did gather mine, in fact. I'd like to say.
Thank you very much for that so far. That is us just at 8:10. So I would like to invite some of our attendees to ask you a couple of questions and for us to continue this discussion, if that's okay. So the first one here, Dave, you've posted a question. Do you want to put your mic on and talk more? You've got a couple of questions there in the chat, but I noticed there you started with one about this distinction between non-human creation. Do you want to jump on?
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. Very stimulating, and I'm going to have to go back and read the book. I'm going to have to go and read the book now to get more depth into it, which I look forward to. But I guess a couple of points really. And Paul talks about excessive suffering in creation as part of our resistance to God. I wonder how you measure excessive suffering. I wonder what our frame of reference is for that when we're only observers inside creation rather than observers from the outside of creation. And there seems to be a very hard distinction in the discussion between non-human creation and human as creatures who are entwined with creation. Both ourselves as beings and the beings of non-human creation are both subject to evolutionary processes. So surely we are both subject to the same evolutionary suffering in a sense. So should we make a huge distinction between non-human and human creatures in this discussion? Thanks.
It's Bethany that makes this distinction most sharply. I think she should answer you, Dave.
Yes, yeah. So certainly, I think the evolved suffering between us and other mammals, for example, is very similar. But I think that the difference that I see is in the way that God calls humans to be creatures who love in a particular way that God doesn't necessarily call chimpanzees to love or dogs to love. And so I sort of say that in having a particular calling that we can and do resist, we then cause suffering that is not according to God's plan. In things like murder and war and cruelty and that sort of thing. Now, when a chimpanzee is also cruel to another creature, some of my colleagues would want to say, well, we should extend morality to the non-human world. Celia Dean Drummond, for example, would kind of say maybe we should think about sin in chimpanzees. For myself, I again have this sharp dividing line because I don't think that chimpanzees are called to be loving creatures. So in their expression of their evolved desires, et cetera, I still think that they're being good. They're doing all that they're meant to do, even if the action side by side is very similar to when a human does the same thing. Then I think it's morally problematic. So this David Lee has talked a little bit about Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet and the hunting and killing that's legitimate and illegitimate side by side on Mars. And so I think it depends on the call placed on creatures. But again, that's a theological framework. I'm not actually looking for different behavior to say one is legitimate and one is not.
I'd certainly agree with Bethany that what makes the difference. Well, I'd agree on at least two counts. One is that yes, we are evolved animals, and we share in what the evolutionary process has given to many creatures. So the kind of contingencies and constraints and so on of our embodied life, our pain, our finitude, our mortality, and so on. Maybe also some of our behavioral instincts. Almost certainly, many of our behavioral instincts are products of our evolutionary history. So yeah, we are creatures. We're animals. What's distinctive about humans, I agree, is can be thought of in terms of a distinctive calling from God. That's one of the most plausible ways to read the doctrine of the Imago Dei, as consisting in some kind of distinctive calling from God, which then poses the question of how we respond. So human sin, that particular form that evil takes, is a failure to respond to the calling that we have from God. And that's the source of a great deal of evil in the world, of course. And not only evil we suffer, but evil that our fellow creatures suffer. I'm more agnostic than Bethany, I think, about what that line looks like between humans and other species. We know a certain amount about our calling from God. We simply don't know what God's calling is to chimpanzees, dogs, or other other than human creatures. I'm certainly persuaded that you can see the beginnings of morality in other species, particularly our primate relatives. And there's been a lot of work by primatologists and others about this over the years. So it seems to me quite plausible that you can see in the great apes, for example, some of the roots of what certainly becomes immoral behavior in humans, and the kinds of excessive violence that Chris was talking about earlier, that he talks about in the book, would be one negative example of that. The question whether chimpanzees can sin is a different question from the question of whether chimpanzees can transgress morally.
Yeah.
They're related, but they're different, because sin is not only or primarily a moral category. Sin is a theological and spiritual category. It's possible, but in order to answer that question, you would need to know what God's calling to chimpanzees is, and we simply don't know that.
Can I say that in human life, we make an attempt to distinguish between tolerable and intolerable suffering. We often understand some suffering as belonging to growth and development, even through the process of aging. We know that there's a certain amount of pain and suffering that's involved in that. Other suffering is felt to be excessive and disproportionate to that process of development. Now, we don't have the language or the insight to be able to make these sharp distinctions between kinds of suffering in the non-human natural world. But because we have emerged from the natural world, I think we can expect that there will be a continuum and some kind of moving boundary between human beings and the rest of creation. I think the fact that we can't sharply distinguish this because of our ignorance and lack of experience doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Can I push you on that, Paul, and ask, do you think that the healing miracles recorded in the Gospels only address disproportionate suffering, or would you say we just don't have the categories to be able to answer that question?
Well, I'll go for your latter option, Michael. There are so many questions involved here about what these healing miracles are anyway, and what exactly is being described. I think it's very difficult to make that kind of judgment.
Great, thank you. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to jump over to Andy McQueen. Do you want to join us and ask your question?
Thank you. I just remind myself how I worded it. I'm intrigued by Paul Fiddes' account of ubiquitous resistance right down to the quantum level. My particular interests are in sort of the non-biotic, the abiotic elements of creation and where we might locate resistance in that. And I just wonder if there's any resonance between this pan-resistance and one of the other ubiquitous bits of the creation that we know about, and that's the second law of thermodynamics. And how that you might respond to that. I mean, analogies, I'm not obviously what we're talking about here, resonances rather than identity, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, I'm personally more interested in the whole span of relatedness at every level, including the quantum level. And people like Ravelli, for example, who don't go for a panpsychic approach, nevertheless do talk about the way that quanta react and respond to each other and relate to each other. And they talk about responsiveness, which is why, I'm interested in this pan-responsiveness rather than panpsychism. I don't think consciousness is necessary for these relations between created entities. So that's where I think my own interest lies.
Thank you. I'm going to open it to the panel. It's talk about subject to the chairs.
Anybody else want to contribute before we move to Andrew Jackson?
Very, very briefly. I mean, I would see the second law of thermodynamics as being part of the fallenness of creation. I don't see that fallenness in terms of resistance in quite the same way that Paul does. But yes, I do see it as being part of. I mean, Paul talks about bondage to decay.
It's the other Paul, by the way. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, easily confused.
Clarify, yeah. Perfect.
Paul's predecessor.
Yeah, and just to represent the spectrum, let me just say that if I just think that the second law of thermodynamics, entropy basically is a measurement of change, and I don't think that change is a problem. I don't think that it's change into life or new life or death that these changes are problematic. So I continue to not see resistance.
But I don't think any of us anticipates entropy being part of the new creation.
No.
No, but it was an essential part of this one.
Yes, I mean, this is why I think we have the mixture
yes,
of the world
I
as
agree.
it is. Death, for example, I can perfectly see death within God's intention for creation, but not death as we know it at present. I would say the same thing about the second law of thermodynamics and entropy. I think this must be part of God's intention for creation, but the way we see it working out is because it's a much more mixed picture now, owing to resistance. I wouldn't simply equate entropy with resistance. The way we experience it, I think, is the question.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on then to Andrew Jackson. We've got more questions flying in. So, Andrew, would you like to join us as well?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, authors. I really enjoyed reading the book. I actually purchased it. I thought it was a fantastic dialectic approach. I think we need more books like that. As someone who's doing research in Eastern patristics, I wondered what you thought of the idea of the incarnation being effectively an only way. If you take the hypothesis that finite creation is going to always fail, inevitably fail in some way, so at base level, behind all suffering, pain, death, there's some kind of failure. And the incarnation being the only way for God to actually complete and mature what he started by a hypostatic union of natures. So, and therefore deification is something similar to hypostatic union, maybe not exactly the same. So that therefore means there is a reason why God didn't go directly to the eschaton, because there had to be that at least logically preceding finite creation to which then he could unite his nature.
Well, I'm quite attracted to that position, I would say. We'd need a lot more time in order to identify the exact congruence between our positions, but I think that's I mean, inevitable failure of this world. How exactly do we judge that failure would be an issue? But that the incarnation was necessary for the world's transformation. I absolutely sympathize with that. Yeah.
Sometimes called incarnation anyway.
Yeah.
I fully endorse and share with you and with Christopher that sense of the incarnation being the required way in which creation is put right. What I don't, I'm afraid, can't quite see is why we should accept the idea that finite being will always fail. If it is constantly in reference to the God who's the author of life, there's no reason why it shouldn't be sustained in being. And in fact, we do have finite life that does not fail precisely in the incarnation. So I don't see why we should accept the premise, although I do like the way that you build the incarnation into the picture.
Well, the premise is based on the fact that anything other than God, by definition, cannot be God, must be less than perfect, less than infinite, etc. And so it's lacking in something, and therefore there is something fragile about it.
Yeah, without God, it must fail. But with God, there's no reason why it should, if it remains in
yes, exactly. So, and the with God that prevents it from failing is the union of natures in Christ, the hypostatic union. So Christ could not sin we will not be able to sin in the eschaton because we will be united in natures, deified, as the Eastern Orthodox Church would say.
Thank you very much. We are down to our last 3 minutes, so if you do need to leave at 8:30, that's fine, but we can leave it open for another 10 minutes just to catch these last 3 questions, if that's okay with our panel. Yeah? Okay, great. Next, we have David Lee then. Would you like to join us with back to C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, I'm relatively outside and I'm not a specialized scientist in anything, although I've got a background in science.
Well, you're very welcome here.
A lot of what we do is based on analogy. A lot of what we do is based on analogy and on parable, and I'm trying to find ways in for something you can't understand. I mean, the classic example, of course, could be quantum mechanics and Schrodinger's cat as a thought experiment to try and find a way in. So C.S. Lewis, Out of the Silent Planet, when I first read that, the thing that struck me is that Ransom ends up on Mars, on an innocent world, full of intelligent life comparable to what humanity is. And Ransom plus some of this life form actually go on a hunt to try and kill the Maka underwater. And they're trying to do this, and that is seemingly allowed by the elders. And at the same time as they've managed to do that, one of these intelligent beings is shot by an evil person who's come along with Ransom. And that's an illegitimate killing happening side by side with what seems to be a legitimate killing. So from the model or analogy or parable perspective, does that offer us lay people a way in to see it? And did that enter any of your thought? Did that particular narrative of C.S. Lewis enter any of your thought processes?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Paul thinks, but I think that might be quite an elegant parable of proportionate and disproportionate struggle and violence.
Mm. And of course, death is experienced differently because it's an unfallen world. Death is still part of the story in the in this parable, but it feels different and is different, in fact, because it doesn't have the sting within it that we call sin. So that's an example, I think, of this mixed picture of existence we have.
And of course, further to that, the Harossa, the sort of the innocent life forms, they do come to their own death in their own time. But this particular incident that we're looking at is a premature death happening because of the introduction of sin, let's call it.
I hate to spoil the agreement breaking out.
This is what we want. Go for it.
But I would be uneasy to see any life-taking as being compatible with the purposes, the harmonious purposes of God, because I think if you look at the cross, what you see is the self-sacrificial nature of the God who created the universe. That seems to me to be an 180-degree difference from the life-taking way in which the world is set up. So even without pain, even if there's no pain, the direction of the two just seems completely at variance. And therefore to say, well, this killing is okay, but that killing is not, seems to me to set up a tension that we can't run with.
Of course, my mind goes immediately to the risen Christ barbecuing fish for his friends and enabling, the killing of 153 fish. So I understand, but I'd resist that, I think.
That has to be seen. Okay, sorry. I think that has to be seen as simply an accommodation to the time, the place, and the limitations of the disciples to whom the risen Christ appears. I'm with Michael on this. I think I mean, storytelling like Lewis's, Lewis, the consummate storyteller, can be so illuminating. Any storytelling also tells you something about the the prejudices and the kind of situation and the limitations of the storyteller. I think an innocent world with innocent hunting in it tells, to my mind, tells us more about C.S. Lewis's own prejudices than what the gospel would teach us. So I'm lined up with Michael on this.
Thank you. Sorry to keep closing you down. Like, this is brilliant, brilliant. We've got two last questions and then I'll let you all go. First from Daniel Button. Would you like to join us?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you're still there. Great, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have immensely enjoyed this whole conversation and discussion. I am, however, a little puzzled as to the level of agreement on the eschatological idea of a consummation in which all creatures are glorified somehow. Even there was mention of resurrection. There was mention of well, this seems to be the driving verse of no more death or mourning or crying or pain, and that seems to be extended to all creatures. And yet, if we simply back up a couple of verses, we see that the context is not about the creaturely creation. The context is, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. It's not talking about creaturely realm. It's talking about this is a particular relationship between God and man. And we somehow want to extend that to all the rest of creaturely life. And what I want to ask is, particularly for the kind of one-way argument, if death was a part of God's good creation, why can death not be part of the new creation, such that there's a continuity between this creation and the creation to come?
Can I start off on that? So I think, first of all, it's perfectly true that most of what you learn from New Testament texts, not quite all, but most of what you learn from New Testament texts about eschatological hope has a focus on human hope. The New Testament is anthropocentric in its interest. There are hints in the New Testament that this promised future hope doesn't just apply to humans, but to the whole creation. Most famously, most noticeably, Romans 8. I think that's one of the things that makes it a legitimate kind of theological development from the beginnings we find in the New Testament. To say that Christian eschatological hope is a hope for all creatures. David Clough in the third part of his first volume of On Animals argues this, I think, very, very kind of fully and persuasively. We have good reasons, grounded in the scriptures and the Christian tradition, to extend what the traditions often wanted to say about eschatological hope for humans to other animals. Why couldn't death be part of eschatological hope for creatures? Well, I mean, yeah, here we're speculating, but it seems to me a reasonable extension, again, of the ways that the Christian tradition, rooted in the Bible, rooted in the New Testament, has habitually talked about eschatological hope, particularly in relation to humans. Continuity and discontinuity between this world and the world to come. Yes, but part of the kind of discussion, disagreement between us in this group has been about the balance between continuity and discontinuity between this world and the world to come. But I think we all agree there has to be some pretty sharp discontinuities. But on any showing, the world to come is the transformation of the present creation in ways that are to a large extent beyond our imagining, and images like the seed and the plant in 1 Corinthians 15 emphasize that there's some kind of continuity. The eschaton is not just the replacement of this creation with another better one. It is the transformation, the fulfillment, but that's going to involve change beyond anything we can imagine. It just seems to me implausible that the ultimate fulfillment of creaturely life in an eschatological future where there's no obvious reason why it has to be limited, should be bounded by death anymore. This just seems to jar somehow with the ways we habitually talk about eschatological fulfillment. Certainly for any creatures that are what Chris calls individual centers of experience.
It just seems that removal of death brings about some pretty tragic unintended consequences, because without death there can be no new life. There's no space. There's certain limited.
That's so in this world, but why should it be so in the world to come?
Okay. Well, now you're really into a realm of speculation of a world which is no longer the planet Earth, and that's an entirely different thing.
I think the eschatological vision, intrinsic to it is the removal of scarcity and limit, and there's no lack of space in heaven.
Thank you very much. So the last thing that I'm going to ask you before we finish the event, so Mary, I'd like to join you to come on and ask. So Mary is coming from a non-theologian point of view and has a question, and I think it'd be nice to maybe go around each one of you and respond to this. But we also just really wanted to thank everybody for staying on a bit later. So Mary, are you still with us and able to pop your mic on, ask your question?
Hi, yes, thank you. Yeah,
yes, thank you.
It's been very interesting, and a lot of things that had never even crossed my mind to think of before. So thank you for the discussion. I'm not a theologian, I'm very much a pragmatist, and I just wondered, after all the discussion, are there different things in your different positions that have affected or direct the way that you view or respond to personal suffering or suffering in those around you? Or is this kind of just a thought experiment world that you see as quite different to your own lives? Thanks.
It's a great question. And much armchair debate about suffering has been criticized on the grounds that we shouldn't sit in our armchairs and collude with it, but get out and do stuff about it. I think that I think this particular subject, which is dealing with the struggle, violence, and competition of billions of years of Earth history, is an example of an area where we can appropriately sit in our armchairs and mull it over with mutual respect, without having to feel that it necessarily that we ought to rush out and do stuff about it.
Anybody else as well?
Yeah, I certainly think that it has real differences in the ways that I try and respond to suffering. And I mean, in some cases, like I think, for example, that there is the possibility of a good death, because I don't think death is only a perversion. And I think that the Christian tradition has a long history of talking about what a good death looks like. And I think that that is something that has been largely lost in the cultural West today. But I think also, when pain and suffering happens, I'm not always looking for a sort of theological meaning to it. Sometimes I think, sometimes that's just an accident, and sometimes, the suffering is the virus is trying to live its own life. It just happened to choose me as a host these last 2 weeks, and so I'm not trying to sort of find a bigger meaning to something like that beyond the sort of obvious of it. And I think that also responds in how I, because I don't think all suffering or all pain is bad, I'm not necessarily trying to remove suffering from my life. I'm trying to listen to it, to learn from it, to respond to it, to use it in the way that I think evolution has supplied it for me to use. And so I do really think that it directs the way that I respond to suffering. But I would be very, very cautious about saying this is how other people should respond, that everybody, has to think it this way. So I sort of say this is how I try and respond in response to when suffering happens to me. But I would very much hesitate to sort of impose that on anyone else.
Mm. Well, as a coda to Beth, I'd just like to say I'm probably the person on this panel who is the closest, at least by what we can guess, to death. And I'm very much coming to terms with the mixed nature of death, both as a natural boundary to life and as an intolerable end to love and potential. So I feel existentially very much part of this question about the whole nature of creation.
Michael, Neil, do you have anything you want to add?
I would, yes, I would. I think pastorally, when one is dealing with suffering, either with somebody else or with oneself, the key thing is not to make God the enemy, the one who's inflicting that suffering upon them. And that has absolutely shaped my theodical thinking, my thinking in this area, that I don't want to say to anybody that God is behind it in any way, shape, or form. I want to say that actually your suffering is the result of creation itself having separated itself from the God who is life, the God who has good purposes for us and harmonious intention for his creatures. And it is that has caused the horrendous things that you are going through, not the will or purpose or even the impotence of God.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think I said earlier that for me, really the chief reason this whole conversation matters is because it's about how we evaluate the worlds we live in, the world that we that we find before us, what we make of it theologically, and how we live and act in the world. The most important kind of implications of this whole discussion are ethical and pastoral and existential in various ways. I think this discussion matters for how we respond to the suffering of other creatures, and it's possible to think further about the kinds of ethical obligations that follow from the kinds of things we've been saying about animal suffering, for example. And I think it's possible to identify some clear ethical implications that I suspect we can all agree on, to a larger extent that we can agree on some of the theological foundations. In terms of what all this means for our own kind of personal experience of suffering and response to it, the questions that we've been debating in this meeting this evening for you, this afternoon for me. Those are part of what come into play when we're faced with the challenge of how we respond to our own suffering or the suffering of those we love. But they're by no means all of it, because we are not only animals, but we're also creatures with a distinctive calling from and relationship to God. And that means that you can say, as Michael and I both want to, pretty much, that any experience of pain or suffering is in some sense, in some way, contrary to God's will. It reflects a way in which, creation is astray from God's good purposes. You can call this evil in that sense, but you can still say, in relation to human life, that there's all kinds of meaning that can be made of it and in it, just because God is always at work to bring good out of evil. And the crucial thing is, for creatures like us, made in the image of God, the crucial thing is how we respond to God, and in God's name, in love to one another in the midst of suffering.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
So interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been brilliant. I am really sorry we are well over time now, but I would just like everyone on the call just to join me in just thanking our panel for not only going to this colloquium, what was it, back in 2022, and starting this discussion with all of these questions, and then it's spanning out now into this book and this discussion. I'm sure there is many more questions. I have a notebook here full of questions for maybe a later date, but this has been super interesting. Please do, everyone, go out if you've not yet managed to get a copy of the book, get a copy of it, and come back to it. But yes, just want to thank you all for coming together and sharing your thoughts. So thank you, Paul, Christopher, Neil, Bethany and Michael, for joining us today and for putting all your thoughts down on paper. And I'm just going to invite Gavin just to close and then let you all get away back to your evenings.
Yeah. Thank you for this evening, everyone. It's extremely stimulating. I think it's the very essence of what I want these conversation events to be about. So much to take away and think through, and all those different views to be thinking about. And thank you especially to Chris and Emily for helping guide us through a lot of the material tonight. As Emily says, you can get a physical copy of the book in various formats, or download it from the link in the chat, which is also on the Ticket Tailor page where you booked to come tonight. Keep an eye on our Ticket Tailor page, because our next conversation event will be going on there very shortly. We also have a prayer event on the 5th of January, just a prayer meeting to pray for the work of Christians in Science. The next conversation is on the 3rd of February, and we'll be meeting with the Reverend Dr. Lucas Mix to discuss his book, Thinking Fair: Rules for Reason in Science and Religion. So you might want to equip yourself with that book ahead of that time. If you would like to support the work of Christians in Science and events like tonight in a more practical way, then can I ask if you would consider whether you might like to become a member or a friend of Christians in Science. You can find details for all of those options on our website. But thank you again so much to our speakers and to Emily, our host tonight. Until next time, take care, God bless, and good night.
Thank you, and have a very Merry Christmas, everyone.
Indeed. Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.